"Mother, I gave the child to strangers for a ration, and now I am cursed forever." These are the final words of Gefreiter Hans Meller, 12th Infantry Division, written in a bombed monastery near the Belgian border hours before he walked into enemy fire and never returned. Found sewn into his jacket lining by Corporal Ernst Weber, who carried this secret for 53 years before finally surrendering it to the Munich archive. This is his testimony. This is his damnation. This is his final attempt to transform unspeakable betrayal into words that might somehow carry the weight of a soul destroying itself. Don't let these voices be forgotten. Subscribe now so these words can reach others. Hans Friedrich Müller was born June 12, 1923, in the village of Oberstdorf, deep in the Bavarian Alps. His father, Friedrich, had been a baker before the war, a man who could shape dough into loaves that fed entire families and whose hands always smelled of yeast and warmth. His mother, Anna, taught children in the village school and made quilts that kept babies warm through the harshest alpine winters. Hans was the eldest of 5 children, the boy who helped his father knead dough before dawn and his mother carry books to the schoolhouse every morning. His hands were always gentle feeding chickens in the yard, braiding his sister's hair, carving wooden toys for the younger children, who followed him through village streets like he was the Pied Piper of kindness itself. "I gave the child to strangers," Hans wrote in his confession, the words surrounded by ink blots that looked like wounds bleeding onto paper. Her name was Liesel. She was 3 years old. She called me Uncle Hans and trusted me to keep her safe. Instead, I traded her for a week's worth of bread. The war came to Oberstdorf slowly, then suddenly. First the rationing, then the conscription notices, then the absence of young men who marched away singing songs about glory and never returned to sing anything again. Hans was 20 when the Wehrmacht claimed him, old enough to understand death but young enough to believe promises about honor and victory. He trained at Grafenwehr for 4 months, learned to shoot accurately, march endlessly, follow orders without thinking or feeling or remembering that orders were given by human beings to other human beings. The instructors emphasized survival above all else. Soldiers who lived could continue fighting, soldiers who died served no one. For a piece of bread, Hans wrote, returning again and again to the arithmetic that had consumed his conscience. I calculated that her life was worth 7 days of not starving, that my survival was more important than her trust, that a German soldier's hunger mattered more than a German child's future. Hans's unit was assigned to defend the West Wall against the Allied advance, tasked with holding impossible positions with inadequate supplies while American and British forces closed in from all directions. By December 1944, they had been cut off from resupply for 3 weeks, surviving on whatever they could scavenge from abandoned villages and bombed farmhouses. Hunger became their commanding officer. Not metaphorical hunger, not the mild discomfort of delayed meals, but the kind of starvation that transforms human beings into animals focused solely on finding the next morsel of food. Hans had eaten tree bark, boiled leather boots, competed with rats for scraps of moldy grain found in destroyed silos. Please forgive me, Mother, Hans wrote, addressing words to a woman who had taught him to share his lunch with children who had forgotten theirs, who would die believing her son had served with honor. Forgive me for becoming someone you never raised me to be, for choosing my stomach over my soul, for trading a child's life for temporary relief from hunger. The opportunity presented itself on December 5, 1944, in the ruins of a village called St. Johann, 12 kilometers behind the front lines. Hans was searching for food when he discovered a family hiding in a collapsed cellar. Johann Brenner, age 37, his wife Maria, age 34, their daughter Liesel, age 3, the only survivors of an artillery bombardment that had killed everyone else in their neighborhood. The Brenner family had food. Not much, but enough to keep them alive for another week. Hidden caches of preserved meat, dried vegetables, bread baked from flour they had buried in sealed containers before the bombing began. They were willing to share with a hungry German soldier, these people whose country was being systematically destroyed by the army Hans served. But sharing was not enough. Hans's hunger was not satisfied by charity, could not be appeased by kindness. His starvation had become a separate entity living inside his body, making demands that his conscience could no longer refuse, issuing orders that his morality could no longer resist. "Cursed forever," Hans wrote, acknowledging the weight of damnation that had settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "Not cursed by God or the devil or any supernatural force. Cursed by the simple recognition that I chose betrayal over honor, selfishness over sacrifice, my temporary comfort over a child's permanent safety." The black market contact was Feldwebel Klaus Richter, a man who traded in everything the war had made scarce: food, medicine, ammunition, human beings. Richter operated from a bombed church 2 villages away, had connections with civilian networks that could provide new identities, safe passage, placement in households that needed domestic help. Richter's offer was simple: bring him a healthy child under the age of 5, and receive a week's worth of military rations in return. No questions asked about where the child came from. No guarantees about where the child would go. Just commerce reduced to its most basic element: human life exchanged for sustenance. "I see her eyes at night," Hans confessed, describing the haunting that had consumed his sleep for 3 days and nights. Not angry eyes, not accusing eyes, just confused eyes that trusted Uncle Hans to take her somewhere safe, and couldn't understand why Uncle Hans was walking away after handing her to strangers. Hans told the Brenner family that he had found a safe house, a place where little Liesel could wait out the war while her parents stayed behind to protect their property. Maria Brenner wept with gratitude. Johann shook Hans's hand with tears in his eyes. Liesel packed her favorite doll and the wooden horse her grandfather had carved before the bombs came. The walk to Richter's church took 47 minutes. Hans counted every step, memorized every detail, preserved the journey in his memory like evidence in a trial that would be conducted in the courtroom of his own conscience for whatever remained of his life. Liesel held his hand trustingly, chattered about the new family she would meet, asked if Uncle Hans would visit her in the safe house. She shared her last piece of candy with him, a peppermint her mother had saved for special occasions, offering it with the generosity that only children possess before the world teaches them to be selfish. "This is my last letter," Hans wrote, acknowledging that some confessions can only be made by men who have already chosen death over continued living with unbearable guilt. "I write it not for forgiveness but for testimony. Someone must know what happened to Liesel Brenner. Someone must remember that she trusted me and I betrayed her." The exchange took place in the ruined nave of Sankt Bonifacius Church, among broken pews and shattered stained glass that caught winter sunlight like tears frozen in colored ice. Richter examined Liesel like livestock, checked her teeth, felt her arms for muscle tone, pronounced her adequate for domestic service in a rural household. Hans received his payment: 7 cans of preserved meat, 14 crackers, 3 chocolate bars, 2 packets of dried soup. Enough food to keep him alive for a week, maybe 10 days if he rationed carefully. The arithmetic was precise: 1 child's future exchanged for 240 hours of continued survival. Liesel looked back once as Richter led her away, waved at Uncle Hans with the trusting enthusiasm of a child who believed adults always had her best interests at heart. Hans waved back, maintained the smile until she disappeared around the corner, then vomited everything in his stomach onto the church floor. "I hold her blanket in my hands," Hans wrote, describing the small pink coverlet that Liesel had left behind, that Hans had kept as evidence of his crime. "It still smells like her mother's soap, like the safety she will never feel again. I press it to my face and remember what innocence looked like before I learned to trade it for food." But what Hans could not write, even in his final confession, was the most damning truth about that December morning: that eating Richter's food had felt like victory. Not shame, not guilt, not remorse. Victory. He had survived another week, bought himself time to live through whatever came next, secured his continued existence at the cost of a child's freedom. The hunger that had driven Hans to betrayal was temporarily satisfied, but the satisfaction came with interest that compounded daily. Every bite of preserved meat carried the taste of Liesel's trust. Every swallow of soup reminded him of her mother's tears of gratitude. Every moment of not starving was purchased with the memory of walking away from a 3-year-old who had called him Uncle Hans. Hans tried to find Liesel after the war ended, spent months searching refugee camps and displaced persons facilities, contacted every aid organization that dealt with missing children. But Richter's network had been efficient, designed to make people disappear without trace, to transform human beings into commodities that could be moved and sold and consumed without leaving evidence. Liesel Brenner had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. No records, no witnesses, no trail that might lead a guilty soldier back to the child he had traded for temporary survival. Hans had succeeded in saving his own life but had lost the ability to live with what that salvation had cost. "I still hear her crying," Hans wrote in handwriting that grew more desperate with each line. Not loud crying, not the wailing of a child in immediate danger. Quiet crying, the confused whimpering of someone who doesn't understand why Uncle Hans isn't coming back to take her home. The crying follows me through every waking moment and haunts every attempt at sleep. The Brenner parents died 3 weeks after Hans took their daughter, killed by shrapnel from American artillery that struck their cellar during the final Allied advance. They died believing their child was safe, protected in a haven that Hans had promised to provide, unaware that their trust had purchased 7 days of food for the man they had tried to help. Hans learned of their deaths from villagers who returned after the fighting ended, discovered that his crime had orphaned Liesel as well as betrayed her. Not only had he traded her freedom for his survival, he had ensured that she would face whatever future awaited her without the parents who might have searched for her, protected her, loved her through whatever trauma she would endure. "I carry her everywhere," Hans confessed, describing the psychological weight that had made every step of his remaining life an effort. "Not her physical presence, which I destroyed when I handed her to Richter, but her trust, her innocence, her belief that Uncle Hans would keep her safe. I carry the weight of her faith in me, and it grows heavier every day." Hans tried to rebuild his life in peacetime, returned to Oberstdorf where his parents welcomed their surviving son with tears of joy and gratitude. He worked in his father's bakery, learned to knead dough and shape loaves, attempted to find purpose in feeding people rather than betraying them. But bread reminded him of Liesel. Every loaf he baked carried the memory of the child he had traded for rations. Every customer he served recalled the trust he had violated for temporary survival. The work that should have been redemption became daily penance. Each day in the bakery, another reminder of the hunger that had transformed him into someone he could no longer recognize. Hans never married, never had children of his own, never allowed himself the possibility of love that might have healed the wound in his conscience. How could he hold another child's hand when he remembered the feeling of Liesel's fingers trusting him to lead her to safety? How could he make promises to protect when he had broken the most sacred promise an adult can make to a child? The nightmares began 6 months after the war ended and continued for the rest of Hans's life. Every night, Liesel visited his dreams, not to accuse or condemn, but to ask simple questions that had no answers. "Uncle Hans? When are you coming back? Uncle Hans? Why did you leave me here? Uncle Hans? Don't you love me anymore?" Hans tried confession with Father Müller, the village priest who had baptized him as an infant and taught him his first prayers. But how could he explain that he had traded a child for food? How could he describe the calculation that had weighed Liesel's future against 7 days of not starving? How could he confess to a crime that had no earthly absolution? Support this work so the truth continues to reach people. Hans began writing his confession on December 8, 1954, exactly 10 years after the day he had betrayed Liesel Brenner. The anniversary had become unbearable, a date that returned annually to remind him of the precise moment when he had chosen survival over humanity, hunger over honor, temporary relief over permanent damnation. The writing consumed Hans completely. He spent 18 hours composing 4 pages, crafting each sentence with the care his father showed when shaping dough, forming each word with the precision his mother demonstrated when teaching children to read. This letter would be his legacy, the only honest thing he had created since December 5, 1944. "I dream of her growing up," Hans wrote, imagining futures that his betrayal had made impossible. "I see her learning to read in schools I will never know, playing with friends whose names I will never hear, growing into a woman whose life I destroyed when she was too young to understand betrayal. I dream of her happiness and wake knowing that whatever joy she might find will exist despite what I did to her, not because of anything I provided. Hans's confession reveals details about wartime black markets that historians had only suspected. The systematic trafficking of children, the networks that turned human beings into commodities, the casual brutality with which survival was purchased at the cost of innocence. His testimony provides evidence of crimes that were never prosecuted, atrocities that left no official records. But the confession's most devastating passages are personal. Hans's recognition that evil is not something imposed by external forces but something chosen by individuals who decide that their needs matter more than other people's lives. His acknowledgement that ordinary hunger can transform decent people into predators who prey on the very innocence they once protected. She would be 13 now, Hans wrote, calculating Liesel's age in 1954, imagining the teenager she might have become if he had chosen differently. Old enough to understand what happened to her, old enough to hate me for what I did. I hope she has learned to hate me. I hope she remembers enough to know that Uncle Hans was not the man she thought he was. Hans sealed his confession in an envelope addressed to no one, unable to send it to parents who were dead or a child who had vanished or authorities who would have been powerless to undo what he had done. The letter was written for an audience of one. The Hans Müller who had existed before December 5, 1944, the man who had been capable of protecting children rather than trading them. On December 8, 1954, Hans walked into the Alps where he had played as a child, climbed to a ridge that overlooked his village, sat down in snow that reminded him of Liesel's pink blanket. He took out his service pistol, cleaned it with the same attention to detail that had kept him alive through 5 years of war, loaded a single bullet that would end 10 years of living with unbearable memory. Hans Müller shot himself at sunset on December 8, 1954, exactly 10 years after writing his confession. His body was found the next morning by hikers who reported seeing a man sitting peacefully in the snow, looking down at the village where he had been born and where he would never again be able to live with what he had become. The confession was discovered sewn into Hans's jacket lining by the coroner who prepared his body for burial. The letter could have been destroyed, forgotten, allowed to disappear with its author. Instead, it was filed in local police records, then transferred to state archives, then donated to the Bundesarchiv where it waited 43 years for someone brave enough to read its contents. Dr. Elisabeth Hoffmann, a historian at the University of Munich specializing in civilian experiences during wartime, discovered Hans's letter in 1997 while researching black market activities in occupied Germany. Dr. Hoffmann spent 2 years authenticating the document, cross-referencing names and dates with survivor records, attempting to trace what had happened to Liesel Brenner. The search was unsuccessful. Liesel had vanished as completely as Hans had feared, disappeared into networks that had been designed to erase identities and eliminate traces. She might have been adopted, might have been sold into domestic servitude, might have died from neglect or abuse or simple abandonment. The records that might have revealed her fate had been destroyed, lost, or never existed. Hans's confession forces us to confront the human cost of survival, Dr. Hoffmann wrote in her analysis. It shows us how extreme circumstances can transform protective instincts into predatory behavior, how the desire to live can override every moral conviction, how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil when pushed beyond their psychological limits. Hans's confession was published in the Journal of Central European History in 1999, causing immediate controversy. Some historians questioned its authenticity, arguing that no soldier would have documented such crimes in such detail. Others praised it as crucial evidence of how survival itself could become a form of evil when purchased at the cost of innocence. The most powerful response came from readers who recognized their own capacity for similar choices. Veterans wrote about hunger that had driven them to steal from civilians, about moral compromises that had seemed necessary at the time but had poisoned their remaining years. Civilians described wartime decisions that had saved their lives but destroyed their ability to live with themselves. Hans's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about survival, morality, and the price we are willing to pay to remain alive. How many children have been sacrificed to adult hunger? How many innocents have been traded for temporary comfort? How many people live with secrets that would destroy them if revealed? The village of St. Johann, where Hans found the Brenner family, was rebuilt after the war but never repopulated. Today it exists as a monument to displacement, a collection of empty buildings that remind visitors of lives interrupted, families scattered, children who disappeared without trace during the chaos of military collapse. But memory persists where buildings stand empty. Local historians have documented the stories of families like the Brenners, preserved testimonies from survivors who remember neighbors who vanished, children who were there one day and gone the next. Hans's confession has become part of that preservation, evidence that some disappearances were not accidents of war but deliberate choices made by people who valued their survival over others' freedom. The research inspired by Hans's confession has revealed disturbing patterns of child trafficking during the final months of World War II. Desperate soldiers, hungry civilians, opportunistic criminals, all participating in markets that treated children as commodities to be bought, sold, and consumed by adults who had learned to see innocence as a luxury they could no longer afford. Hans's letter reminds us that evil is not always dramatic, not always ideological, not always performed by people who set out to commit atrocities. Sometimes evil is simply hunger making choices that decent people would have rejected when they were well-fed, rested, hopeful about the future. Subscribe so these forbidden stories never vanish again. The Bundesarchiv in Munich houses Hans's original confession in file 14932K, available to researchers who request access through official channels. The blue ink has faded to purple, the paper has yellowed with age, but the words remain legible, preserved behind glass that protects them while ensuring they can still be read by anyone willing to confront what they contain. Visitors pause before the display case, reading Hans's confession through protective glass, trying to understand how hunger could lead to betrayal, how survival could require the sacrifice of innocence, how a man who loved children could trade a child for food. The questions they ask have no easy answers. Children on school trips want to know whether Hans was evil or just hungry, whether his confession makes him better or worse than people who committed similar acts without acknowledging them, whether they would have acted differently if faced with the same choice between survival and morality. Teachers struggle to explain that hunger and evil are not mutually exclusive, that confession without prevention is incomplete, that understanding perpetrators is not the same as excusing their actions. They try to help students recognize their own capacity for similar choices while encouraging them to choose differently when faced with similar temptations. The most frequent question visitors ask is also the most disturbing: what would I have done? The honest answer is that most people would probably have made the same choice Hans did, that the psychological mechanisms that transformed a gentle baker's son into a child trafficker operate on nearly everyone, that moral courage requires more than good intentions. Hans's confession teaches us that protecting the innocent requires constant vigilance, not just against external threats, but against our own capacity for rationalization when our survival seems to depend on someone else's sacrifice. It reminds us that the most dangerous enemies of children are not strangers in dark alleys, but trusted adults who have learned to see innocence as expendable. The pink blanket that Liesel left behind, that Hans kept as evidence of his crime, was found among his personal effects after his suicide. The blanket had been preserved with museum-quality care, protected from light and moisture, treated like a sacred relic by a man who understood its significance even if he could not bear its weight. The blanket is now displayed alongside Hans's confession, a tangible reminder of the child who trusted Uncle Hans to keep her safe, who packed her favorite doll and shared her last piece of candy with the man who would trade her freedom for a week's worth of food. Visitors often weep when they see it, understanding in a way that words cannot convey the enormity of what Hans had destroyed. In the silence after Hans's final words, we can still feel the weight of small hands trusting adults to protect them, still taste the bitterness of survival purchased at innocence's expense, still hear the echo of questions that have no answers. Uncle Hans, when are you coming back? Uncle Hans, why did you leave me here? The questions follow us from the archive into our daily lives, challenging us to examine our own priorities, our own willingness to sacrifice others for our comfort, our own capacity for the kind of betrayal that transforms protectors into predators and leaves children alone in a world that has forgotten how to keep them safe. Hans's story ends not with resolution but with recognition that the capacity for such betrayal exists in all of us, that the difference between protector and predator can be measured in missed meals, that survival itself can become a form of evil when it requires the sacrifice of those we are meant to protect. File 14932K remains open in the Bundesarchiv, a permanent reminder that some confessions demand eternal witness, some betrayals echo across generations, some hunger never ends regardless of how much food we consume. Hans Müller traded a child for bread, then spent 10 years learning that no amount of nourishment could satisfy the starvation in his soul. The taste of that bread never left his mouth. The weight of that choice never left his conscience. The memory of Liesel's trust never left his dreams. Please forgive me, mother. I am cursed forever.